What surprised me was how easy detachment became once I stopped fighting the old longing. The childhood ache that had once shaped everything in me began to dissolve. Not because my mother changed, but because I no longer expected her to. I could sit in the same room with her and feel steady, unpulled by the old instinct to bridge emotional gaps. The wound that had once defined my sense of self softened into something smaller, something I could hold without being consumed by it. Redefining family didn't erase my history, but it reframed it. I understood that connection wasn't measured by obligation or blood, but by presence, by sincerity, by the quiet feeling of being met rather than managed. And in allowing myself to build relationships that reflected this truth, I finally stepped out of the shadow of what I once lacked. This new understanding didn't come with triumph or bitterness. It came with a calm acceptance that prepared me for the final clarity, the realization that peace was never going. Looking back now, I understand that peace doesn't come from changing another person. It comes from releasing the hope that they will become someone they cannot be. My mother wasn't unkind in intention, only limited in ways I spent years trying to interpret as my own shortcomings. What I once saw as a reflection of my worth was, in truth, simply the boundary of her emotional reach. Accepting that truth felt less like losing something and more like finally setting down a weight I had carried without question. I no longer measure closeness by effort or silence by failure. I've learned that love that requires chasing isn't love that will ever feel safe. Some bonds remain shallow not because we are unlovable, but because the other person cannot meet us where depth begins. There is a quiet freedom in recognizing this. It allows space for gentler forms of connection, for relationships that grow without strain, for versions of myself that do not shrink to be tolerated. I don't resent my mother, and I don't idealize her either. She is simply a human being with her own history, her own gaps, her own limitations. Understanding that helps me carry our story without the ache that once defined it. I don't wait for words she will never say, and I don't mourn the closeness we never had. Instead, I hold the life I've built, the steadiness, the chosen family, the calm that comes from no longer reaching across an emotional distance that was never mine to close. Peace arrived, not as a moment, but as a gradual settling inside me. And in that settling, I finally understood that approval is optional, but self-possession is not. It was the quiet ending I never expected, yet the only one that truly belonged to me alone. People around us noticed before she did. My aunt commented that I seemed more sure of myself lately. A teacher remarked on the steadiness in my voice during presentations. Friends who once saw me shrink to keep the peace now saw someone who took up her natural space. I didn't explain the shift to anyone. Some changes don't need translation. They simply become visible. My mother sensed it in ways she couldn't articulate. She watched me with a new kind of uncertainty, as if trying to understand a language she had once assumed she knew. When she spoke to me, there was a pause afterward, as though she was waiting for the reassurance I no longer offered. I answered plainly, kindly, without leaning forward to close the distance. It was subtle, but undeniable. She no longer held the emotional center. I did. Not because I had taken anything from her, but because I had finally reclaimed what I had been giving away for years: my energy, my steadiness, my constant willingness to reach first. Standing in my own calm felt like stepping onto solid ground after years of balancing on something unstable. I began making decisions without anticipating her approval or bracing for her disinterest. I started enjoying my achievements for myself rather than presenting them as offerings. Instead of trying to earn closeness, I focused on becoming someone I enjoyed being with, someone whole, even in quiet moments. This wasn't confidence in the loud, triumphant sense. It was something softer, more enduring, a quiet self-validation that didn't need applause or reassurance. I no longer feared disappointing her, because I finally understood that her limitations had never been my responsibility to navigate. And with that understanding, the emotional landscape between us changed. She could no longer pull me into old patterns with a glance or an absent-minded comment. I was steady in a way she wasn't used to, present but no longer orbiting around her. This was the real reversal, not power over her, but power within myself. And as I settled deeper into that steadiness, I could feel the next shift approaching, a widening distance, not born of resentment, but of a new identity forming beyond the reach of her approval. In the months that followed, I began to understand that family could be something other than the people who shared my last name. It could be the teacher who noticed when my voice steadied. It could be the friend who listened without interrupting. It could be the mentor who saw potential in me without requiring proof. These were small anchors, quiet, steady forms of connection that didn't demand performance or restraint. For the first time, closeness felt safe rather than conditional. I didn't have to earn my place in their lives. It existed naturally, without negotiation. I didn't set boundaries with my mother through speeches or declarations. Instead, I allowed my actions to reflect the truth I had already accepted. I visited when I had the emotional space. I left when I felt my energy draining. I no longer explained decisions or softened truths to ease her discomfort. I responded to what she offered, rather than what I wished she could be. The boundary wasn't a wall, it was a quiet filter that kept me connected without losing myself. Gradually, something in her began to shift, not dramatically, but in the tentative way people react when an unspoken pattern breaks. She started asking questions she never asked before, small things meant to signal attention. She lingered in doorways as if waiting for the emotional cues I had stopped providing. It was subtle, almost hesitant, like she sensed a change without understanding its source. I responded kindly, but without the old instinct to fill the gaps. I no longer offered explanations for my mood or softened my tone to make things easier. I didn't embellish stories or share unprompted details. I let her experience the version of me that had always existed beneath the layers of effort. Steady, self-contained, and uninterested in forcing connection. My silence wasn't punishment, it was alignment. I was finally matching the amount of emotional energy she consistently offered. And in doing so, I realized how lopsided our relationship had been, not out of malice, but out of pattern. A pattern I no longer felt responsible to uphold. There was a quiet power in this newfound stillness. It wasn't a defense mechanism or an attempt to provoke a reaction. It was simply the natural consequence of seeing the truth clearly. Once I stopped chasing something she wasn't equipped to give, the space between us became an honest reflection of who we both were. And as that space widened, she began to feel the absence, subtle at first, then more distinctly, of the emotional weight I had carried for years. It was only the beginning of her realization, but it marked the point where the balance between us started to shift. Withdrawal, I learned, could be a kind of gentleness too. The first sign of her discomfort came in a question so gentle I almost missed its weight. One evening, while drying dishes beside me, she asked why I'd been quiet lately. It would have sounded casual to anyone else, but I recognized the unfamiliar edge beneath it. My silence had finally reached her, slowly, then suddenly, and she didn't know where to place it. I told her I was fine, because I was. It was the truest answer I'd ever given her. She nodded, unsettled by how little the moment demanded from her. For years, my emotions had been the softer ground she walked on, absorbing every shift in her mood. Now the ground felt flat, unresponsive, and she sensed the difference. In the days that followed, she began checking in at odd times, asking questions that came out disjointed, as if rehearsed without conviction. Did something happen at school? You've been distant. Are we okay? The words themselves weren't new, but the intention was. She was trying, not deeply, not steadily, but trying, in a way that hinted at her own discomfort more than concern for me. I responded kindly, always without elaboration. My neutrality confused her. She was accustomed to me filling the silence, smoothing tension, translating her brief gestures into closeness. Now, when she offered a sliver of attention, I didn't rush to meet it. I simply received it as it was, small, inconsistent, fleeting. Once, she reached out in a rare, unguarded moment, placing her hand on my shoulder while asking about my schedule. The gesture felt borrowed, as though she'd seen other mothers use it and decided to replicate it without understanding the language behind it. When I smiled politely instead of leaning into the touch, something flickered across her face, confusion, maybe even a quiet sting. She wasn't losing me, she was losing the version of me who had made her emotional life effortless. Her attempts grew sporadic after that. Some days she hovered, searching for openings that no longer existed. Other days she withdrew altogether, retreating into familiar patterns rather than confronting the discomfort of change. I didn't follow, I didn't correct, I didn't compensate. I wasn't withholding love, I was simply no longer extending myself beyond what she offered, and without the constant stream of effort I once poured into the space between us, the imbalance became impossible for her to ignore. These were not consequences I engineered, they were the natural unraveling of a dynamic built on my willingness to fill every gap. Now that the effort had been removed, the gaps showed themselves plainly. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the balance between us began to tilt, not in triumph, but in truth, creating the quiet foundation for the shift that would come next. What surprised me most was how quietly the balance shifted. There was no confrontation, no defining conversation, just a gradual settling into myself. The more grounded I became, the clearer everything felt. I wasn't waiting for her reactions anymore. I wasn't studying her expressions to understand my place. My worth no longer hinged on the temperature of her attention, and that alone changed the entire structure of our relationship. With that understanding, my internal pressure eased. I no longer waited for her to notice changes in my voice or pauses in my sentences. I no longer offered pieces of myself, hoping they might anchor her attention. Instead, I allowed her to exist as she was, without the weight of my longing pressing against her limitations. This shift wasn't dramatic. It happened quietly, in the pauses of our conversations and the spaces where I once tried to fill silence. I answered when spoken to, but I stopped reaching. I listened, but I stopped interpreting every word as evidence for or against her love. I simply let our exchanges be exactly what they were. Oddly, this created a sense of emotional balance I hadn't known before. Without the burden of chasing her, I had room to acknowledge my own needs. I recognized how often I had deferred them, folding myself into smaller shapes to accommodate her comfort. Understanding her limitations pushed me toward the edges of my own self-neglect. From that new vantage point, I saw how deeply I had internalized the belief that love required effort, adjustment, and performance. It was unsettling to realize how much of my identity had been shaped around earning connection that never arrived. But it was also grounding. Awareness gave me permission to stop contorting myself for what was never mine to claim. And as acceptance took root, I felt a quieter truth forming beneath it. Stepping back wasn't an act of rebellion or punishment, it was a way of returning to myself. I didn't need to announce anything or redefine our relationship. I only needed to stop reaching. Once clarity settled in, my withdrawal didn't begin with a declaration. It began with the absence of effort. I stopped rehearsing conversations in my head. I stopped offering pieces of myself as invitations she never accepted. The shift was so subtle, it felt almost imperceptible, even to me. But silence is its own kind of movement, and mine began to grow. I no longer initiated our exchanges. If she asked how I was, I answered simply, without folding my emotions into something easier to hold. When I achieved something, I didn't present it to her like a gift wrapped in hope. I let my accomplishments belong to me. The need for her approval loosened its grip until it felt unnecessary, like a habit I had finally outgrown. I didn't avoid her. Avoidance requires a kind of intensity I no longer carried. Instead, I became a calm observer in a relationship where I had once been an eager participant. I noticed how often she filled silence with trivialities, how she gravitated toward people who required nothing deeper than presence. I saw how easily she mistook proximity for closeness. Watching her from this distance wasn't painful, it was strangely instructive. At first, she didn't notice anything had changed. She moved through our interactions with the same casual detachment, expecting me to bridge the emotional space between us as I always had. I had been the one who nudged conversations forward, who offered reassurance, who kept the air steady. Without my efforts, our exchanges became functional, pleasant, empty. Not breaking. Breaking suggests pain. This was lighter, quieter, like a knot loosening after being held too tightly for too long. I saw her clearly for the first time. Her distance wasn't a reaction to me, it was who she was. Her warmth had always been selective, and I had spent my entire childhood trying to fit into the narrow spaces where she allowed connection. The moment wasn't devastating, it was clarifying. I felt a strange steadiness settle in my chest, an understanding that had been waiting for acknowledgement. I wasn't unworthy, I was simply reaching for a person who had limited emotional reach. Once that truth revealed itself, the chase lost its purpose. I didn't announce anything or pull away dramatically. I just stopped imagining a future where she would become someone different. And in that quiet acceptance, something in me shifted, subtle but irreversible, setting the stage for the clarity that would follow. After that moment in the kitchen, something inside me went quiet in a way that felt different from the silence I had practiced for years. It wasn't resignation or hurt, it was clarity settling into place. I stopped reaching for explanations that softened her absence. I stopped bending myself around narratives that never fit. I began studying our relationship the way one studies an old photograph, noticing what had always been visible but never recognized. My mother wasn't withholding affection from me specifically, she simply moved toward people who required nothing deeper than surface connection. Intimacy unsettled her. Vulnerability made her shift her gaze. Consistency was never her strength. Seeing her this way felt almost merciful. It allowed me to release the idea that I had failed some unspoken test. Her emotional distance wasn't a verdict on my worth, it was the limit of her own capacity. When I viewed her through that lens, the years of striving felt strangely weightless, like dust drifting off a shelf. I didn't feel anger, which surprised me. Anger requires expectation, and mine had dissolved. What remained was a steady understanding that she gave what she could, even if it was far less than what I needed. Accepting that truth didn't heal the old emptiness, but it stopped me from widening it with hope that no longer served me. Distance became easier once I saw the architecture beneath her behavior. She practiced selective attachment, offering warmth where it demanded little and withdrawing where it required presence. She preferred the safety of shallow waters, where affection could be performed without ever risking emotional closeness. I had spent years treading deep waters alone, waiting for her to join me. In the years that followed, I tried to reshape myself into someone easier to love. I didn't think of it as changing, it felt more like smoothing down edges I imagined were too sharp. I studied the way my mother responded to others and adjusted myself accordingly. If enthusiasm pushed her away, I softened it. If vulnerability made her uncomfortable, I hid it under practiced calm. I learned to speak in careful tones, asking for little, offering more than I truly had. It became a quiet performance, one I repeated so often it eventually felt natural. The strange part was how easily I convinced myself that this was maturity rather than survival. I believed harmony depended on minimizing my presence. So I excelled in school, kept my room clean, met expectations before they formed. Achievement became a language I hoped she might understand. But even when I succeeded, the moments were brief, her attention already drifting elsewhere. I told myself she was busy, tired, distracted, anything that made the distance feel logical. And because children prefer blame over confusion, I turned everything inward. I assumed my needs were excessive, my emotions inconvenient, my existence something to manage rather than embrace. The more I adjusted, the more disconnected I became from my own reactions. I performed closeness without feeling it, mirroring what I thought intimacy should look like. Inside, I was measuring every word, testing every expression, making sure nothing felt heavy enough to push her away. Still, a quiet longing remained, a hope that if I were light enough, agreeable enough, she might reach back someday. But hope carried its own exhaustion, a weight that grew heavier each year. There were nights when I lay awake rehearsing conversations that would never happen. The fear of becoming a burden shaped everything, even the way I breathed around her. I didn't realize then that emotional starvation can feel like normal life when you've never tasted anything richer. What I understood was simpler. Staying quiet kept the peace, and keeping the peace kept me close enough to not be forgotten. I didn't expect that the moment that finally broke the pattern would be so small, almost forgettable to anyone else. But for me, it marked the beginning of a truth I could no longer ignore. It appeared quietly, reshaping everything I believed before. The moment that changed everything didn't arrive with anger or confrontation. It came quietly, almost politely, the way truth sometimes does when it's finally tired of waiting. I was 17, standing in the kitchen with a letter in my hand, an acceptance into an academic program I had worked toward for years. It wasn't just an achievement, it was the first thing I had ever done entirely for myself, something I hoped might bridge the distance between us. I handed her the envelope, trying to hide the tremor in my voice. She opened it, skimmed the first few lines, and set it on the counter as if it were a utility bill. Then she turned to answer a message from her sister, her face softening with warmth I had never earned, no matter how carefully I tried. I waited for her to return to the letter, to me, to the moment, but she didn't. She talked for several minutes, laughing, her attention fully wrapped around someone else's life. When she finally looked back at me, she simply said, "That's good, Clara," already moving toward the laundry basket. It wasn't the dismissal itself that stung. I had grown accustomed to those. It was the realization that I had expected something different. I had believed, even after all those years, that effort could eventually coax closeness from her. Watching her walk away, I felt something inside me unclench. My name is Clara Whitmore, and I was 9 years old when I first understood that some mothers love their children in ways that never quite reach them. I didn't have the language for it then. I only had impressions. Small, drifting moments that settled into me like dust no one bothered to wipe away. My mother was there, in the most literal sense, her footsteps in the hallway, her voice calling my name, her keys rattling in the bowl near the door. But the part of her that should have turned toward me never seemed to arrive. I remember trying to read her face the way other children read storybooks. When she smiled at my older cousins, it looked effortless. When she smiled at me, it felt like she was lifting something heavy. If I brought her a drawing, she would nod while scanning the room for whatever thought she had misplaced. If I asked for help, she would respond, but always with the distracted tone of someone keeping an eye on another doorway. I learned to shrink my excitement to fit her attention span. I learned to silence questions that required more than a brief answer. And I learned, without anyone teaching me, that reaching for what isn't offered only deepens the distance. At the time, I didn't see it as neglect. I assumed closeness was supposed to be subtle, maybe even quiet to the point of invisibility. Children normalize anything they live inside, and I was no different. What I carried forward was the belief that emotional carefulness kept things stable, that if I stayed small enough, maybe she would turn toward me on her own. I didn't realize until much later how deeply those early patterns would shape the way I moved through every relationship that followed. Being unseen didn't happen all at once. It revealed itself slowly, the way fading light makes a room feel different before you notice the sun is gone. I began observing the contrast in my mother's interactions long before I understood what it meant. With my cousins, she asked follow-up questions, laughed easily, remembered their preferences. With neighbors, she became unexpectedly warm, offering attention that felt effortless. Around her friends, she bloomed in ways I rarely witnessed at home. With me, the air stayed thinner. When I shared a good grade, she responded with a quiet, "That's nice," already turning towards something else. If I tried to explain a worry, she redirected the conversation to a chore or a reminder. Nothing she did could be called cruel. It was more like her emotional focus had a hierarchy, and I existed somewhere near the bottom without ever knowing why. The more I noticed the difference, the more carefully I tried to present myself. I spoke softer, shortened stories, trimmed reactions. I convinced myself that she was simply tired, that I was demanding too much, that other people were easier to love because they didn't overthink every interaction the way I did. There were moments that should have felt small, but settled heavily. Her interrupting my excitement to answer someone else's question. Her forgetting plans we had made, but remembering every detail of someone else's day. Her eyes drifting past me when I needed them to stay. I started to wonder if invisibility was just my natural place in the world. I didn't feel rejection. Rejection requires intention. What I felt was something quieter, a kind of emotional translucency. I was there, but light passed through me. At that age, I didn't consider that the problem wasn't me. I assumed that if I could be less sensitive, more interesting, more anything, she might eventually see me the way she saw others. That belief followed me into the next stage of my life, where the need to earn attention slowly turned inward, becoming something heavier and far more defining, and it would shape everything quietly.